Thank you, Claire. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Klaus, indeed, for the kind invitation here. I knew Klaus in Washington, so it seemed like a very natural thing when he invited me down to Chapel Hill that I should do so, and all the more so because I've just spent the last 3 days at the convention in Charlotte, and after 3 nights attending a convention of this nature, it's a great source of comfort and relief to have an opportunity to come to Chapel Hill and talk a little bit about issues to do with Ireland, to do with Europe, to do with the relationship, or indeed to do with anything you want to discuss later on. I'm not going to go on too long. I will speak for about maybe 20 minutes and then we go to a Q&A, and as Klaus says, I'm absolutely happy to take questions on any subject. Can't guarantee that I'll be able to give an answer in every respect, but I'll certainly try. So the floor will genuinely be open, and I look forward to engaging with you. For us, it's extremely important to get out. I'd rather that I was not here discussing Ireland and the Euro crisis, but given the nature of what's been happening in Ireland and what's been happening in Europe, it's important that I should do so. If 10 years ago I came here, I can tell you there would be only one subject that I would be talking to you about, and that would be the subject of trying to establish peace in Northern Ireland. It was a subject that would have dominated our discourse. It certainly dominated our presence here in the United States as a representative of the Irish government, or for the Irish government. It was a major, major challenge to our country, and it was a major crisis that had to be addressed. Fortunately, we're in a situation today where we do have peace in Northern Ireland. We do have peace on the island of Ireland, and we do have established and the best set of relations between Ireland and the United Kingdom in the history of the relationship between our two islands. So that's a good success story. And then when I came to the United States in 2007, the first thing I would say is that I was proud to represent a country at peace, which we are and which we were then. And I was proud to represent a country that was prospering and developing like no other time in its history. Well, as I say, the first part of it's true. The second part, I've had to adjust the narrative a little bit as we've gone along. But I would like to share some of those insights with you, and I appreciate I'm among an audience and faculty here who are pretty familiar with this subject to begin with. I haven't got all the answers. I wish I could say to you that I'm going to share to you today some wonderful insights which provide the definitive solution to whether it's Ireland's problems or Europe's problems. But on the other hand, I'm just happy to speak about them, and I'm happy to have an opportunity to do so, and to be in the company of my colleague, Paul Gleeson, who's our consul in Atlanta. And despite the rather challenging situation in Ireland, one of the things we have been able to do over the last few years is, believe it or not, to open a new office in the United States, a new consulate, as we have done in Atlanta. And when I tell you how unusual this is, you need to bear in mind that this is the first consulate, career consulate, that Ireland has opened in the United States since Prohibition. So it's, but finally we've discovered that there is a part of the United States that we need to pay a little bit more attention to, and that's this area here, starting in North Carolina, and in Paul's case, all the way down to Florida, and to begin to fly the Irish flag maybe in ways that we haven't done so before, because as all of you know, there's a rich connection between this part of the world, between this part of the United States and Ireland over the generations, and indeed this was probably one of the inaugural areas where the Irish in the 18th century, which was before the major wave of emigration, would have come to, down the Shenandoah Valley, and obviously for many of them making their homes on the edges of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and this area would have been very, very familiar to them. So it's appropriate that after all of these years that I should finally come here to acknowledge that fact, and just to share in some of that wonderful experience that is the experience of the Irish in the United States. Because if the Irish are here in Chapel Hill or here in North Carolina, from the generation perhaps that came here in the 18th century, of course, in succeeding generations, the Irish have found themselves into every corner and every part of the United States. And in every corner of the United States, there is Irish America. And that's something we're enormously mindful of. At times in our past, this was, the question of immigration from Ireland was a source of difficulty for us. But in more recent years, it's also a source of pride in the accomplishments and the achievements of our diaspora of whom in the United States there are, at last count, at least 40 million. And I think on St. Patrick's Day, that figure approaches 100 million. So, in any event, I'm just very pleased, and I'm going to speak a little bit about Ireland, the Ireland that I represent. I'm very proud to represent, speak to you about where we have come in Ireland, the story of Ireland's tremendous achievements on the economic field, the difficulties that we have encountered and continue to try and grapple with, how that all interfaces with our European, the European Union, of which we're a proud member, and I mean, that goes without saying that we're active and proud members of the European Union and have been since 1973, and also we're members of the euro currency area with 16 other countries, so we share that currency in common. And we're deeply, just to make sure that it's fully appreciated, we're deeply committed to this relationship with Europe. We're deeply committed to this relationship with our euro member, fellow euro member countries, and obviously we're deeply committed to finding a way forward in Europe, which assures Europe's continuing success. Ireland enjoyed a sustained boom for a period of about 15 years, from the mid-1990s almost until 2008. And it was a source of tremendous international attention, the fact that Ireland prospered like never else before in its history, or indeed among European member states was one of the fastest growing countries in the in Europe, or indeed in the world. This growth that we experienced at times reached 7%, 8%, 9%, the type of growth rates that you'll today associate with China, and the type of growth rates we dearly love to have again. But they were the growth rates that we were experienced during that period of the boom, which started in the mid-1990s, after a very, very difficult 1980s. But we got our act together, and the 1990s, as the 1990s emerged towards 2000, we began to enjoy tremendous success. And it's very important, I think, to appreciate the fact that this success, therefore, was not a flash in the pan. It was not just a one-year wonder or a two-year wonder. It was a sustained period of growth which lasted for almost 15 years. And important to understand that the reasons why we grew so successfully in those years, and the reasons why Ireland was a success, really are all still there today. The only problem is that we have had to manage in the meantime, over more recent years, a crisis associated with the banking crisis and with a property bubble which spectacularly exploded in 2008. So in that period of 1995 to really 2008, Ireland enjoyed tremendous growth. We enjoyed, essentially coming towards the end of that period, we enjoyed full employment, and for those of you who appreciate the statistics in this, full employment in our case was something around 4%. That represents full employment statistically in our case. This had never ever happened in our history before. Ireland had always been a country which could never look after the totality of its people at home, so therefore people emigrated, as they did over the generations, and as they did in quite significant numbers also in the 1980s. But in this period of growth, we had full employment, we had net immigration, so instead of Ireland exporting its own people, we were, for the first time in our history, becoming a country, and became a country, and still are a country, which has now absorbed a considerable amount of new people, particularly from Eastern Europe, and particularly after 2004, when the European borders opened up and when Ireland itself opened its borders to all the new member states who became members of the European Union on the 1st of May 2004. So this is a big change in the topography of Ireland, in the landscape of Ireland, in the demography of Ireland. The fact that we went from a homogenous country, which was 100% Irish, 100% almost, or slightly less than 100% Catholic, to a country which now comprises many different nationalities and indeed many different religions, and with all the challenges that go along with that. But it was our growth was so substantial that growing our population and bringing in a workforce, particularly from Eastern Europe, particularly from Poland, became a natural for us. Obviously, when the boom ended, and after the Lehman Brothers collapse, Ireland felt the full force of it. We suffered a property boom collapse. The bubble collapsed in 2008, and we went into a very, very dramatic and frightening free fall. I cannot describe to you just how frightening that was, obviously for people immediately affected who lost their jobs, but for others who risked and feared that they would lose their jobs as well. And for a national economy, which the figures for which were cascading at a dramatic rate going from 2008 to 2010. If I tell you that in general terms, the revenue for a small country as is Ireland, in any one year leading up to 2007, would have been in the region of 48 to 50 billion euros per year. That would be the tax take in those years, in those boom years. And in the space of 1 year, we went down from 48 to 32, just like that. You can understand the crisis that we had in our hands. And particularly also at that time when it was impossible to know where the floor was. So there was a cascade. If you knew it was going to stop at 32, well, you wouldn't be happy, but at least you know that you stop at 32 and you build from 32 upwards. But we didn't know where the floor was, but eventually the floor has been established. It's not great, obviously. It remains in around 32. Revenues at the moment are around $32 billion euros a year. We have the benefit today of having stabilized as a country, but in achieving that period of point of stability, which is now there and where our country is growing again. Last year we grew by 1.4% GDP. Not spectacular, but it's certainly better than 2009 when we lost 8% of our economy in 1 year alone. In 2010 we lost 2% of our economy, all very dramatic. Last year, 2011, we grew by 1.4%. This year we're going to grow by about 1%. Again, better than the alternative, but really not good enough. We need to do an awful lot better than that to regain employment and to get back into the 4s, 5s, 6s and 7s, which will really see our economy growing again substantially. Tragically and unfortunately, we couldn't find our way out of this crisis on our own. Coming into 2010, it very quickly became apparent that we were losing our capacity to borrow money, and every country borrows money. And in all the boom years, we were a AAA country in terms of borrowing rates, but coming into 2010, with the collapse of the banks, with the collapse of the property market, we were no longer in a position to borrow on the external market at rates that were sustainable. So we had to get help. And politically, this was a very difficult thing for a country to do. You see today how difficult it is for Spain, to get to a point where they ask for help. In our case, we really didn't have any choice. If we wanted to borrow money, we couldn't do so. So the Troika, the European Central Bank, the European Commission, and the IMF had to be invited in, had to step in to accommodate us in a bailout program, which would allow us to continue to borrow money at reasonable rates. But of course, subject to conditions. Terms and conditions most certainly did apply, and most certainly do apply. So we're at the moment in the middle of a bailout program. In fact, we're more than halfway through the bailout program, and we're more than 2/3 of the way through the measures that we've been obliged to take. And this is a very, very difficult thing for a sovereign country to do and to accept. To have external bodies come in and really dictate the circumstances under which they are going to facilitate you with money. But we had to do it. We had no choice. But the good news is that we're halfway through the program, and we're 2/3 of the way through the measures. And the even better news is that on all the metrics and all the measurements that go along with this program, and you are measured every 3 months, they come in and they check out that you're doing what you said you'd do, and that you're reaching your targets. We have achieved absolutely full points on the basis of 7 different reviews over the last 7 different periods. So this is something that obviously we'd rather not be in, but it's something we are in. And most importantly, it's also something that once we're in, we honour our commitments. Ireland is honouring its commitments, no matter how painful they are. We are paying our way, we are paying our debt, and as I say, there are aspects of all of that we'd like to kind of reconfigure. But the commitment, there's nobody running away from the obligation, our international obligations, our obligations to these institutions. So this is something that if the United States had done what we have done over the last 3 years, this year the United States would be enjoying a budget surplus of $1.5 trillion. That'll give you some idea of the adjustment that we've had to make in our economy to bring it into line and to bring our deficit ultimately by 2015 down to 3%. This year we're at 8.6% deficit, which still seems like a lot of money and a lot of ground to make up. But we are committed and we're confident that we will be down to 3% deficit, which is the European commitment, by 2015. Obviously, this is painful. This is painful apart from the politics of it, apart from getting your head around having external advisors or whatever institutions in any event guide you and advise you as to what needs to be done. It's also difficult, for people to, obviously, the consequences have been very, very difficult for people. So unemployment has gone up, having, as I say, reached full employment as recently as 2006, 2007 at 4%. This year we're somewhere between 14 and 15%, which is a very, very big challenge for our country. We have seen a renewal of emigration, so younger Irish people in particular are emigrating again, not so much to the United States, but most particularly to places like Australia, Canada, and obviously the UK remains a traditional source of immigration for Irish people. So that's a kind of a return to the days of emigration which we thought we had left behind. But people obviously are a little bit more mobile maybe than they were previously. The younger generation are a little bit more, they're certainly well equipped because we've produced a generation of Irish younger people who are among the best educated Irish people ever, and among the most educated in the cohort of among their international peers. Unfortunately, we've invested in all these young people, but at least in the short term, because we like to believe that they will come back eventually when we finally see recovery. Unfortunately, in the short term, many of them have chosen to leave the country and to take up opportunities elsewhere. So these are all huge challenges for us, and when we were in the eye of the storm, if I'd been speaking here 2 years ago, the story in the international media was all about it was originally about Greece, and we'll come to Greece maybe in a minute, but then it was about Ireland, and we were the centre of attention that we thought we would never be, and we were the centre of attention that we thought we'd never, certainly that we'd never wish to have. It's all fine having people focus in your country, but when the focus on your country was in circumstances like I've just described, this wasn't a very pleasant situation to be in. But in any event, as we have gone through this bailout program, it has emerged that we were not completely alone, that we weren't so exceptionally unfortunate that there weren't others that were about to experience the same trauma. So we had Greece to begin with, then you had Ireland, then you had Portugal, and lo and behold today, the story goes on, and we have Spain, and who knows who else will need some adjustments as we go forward. So this is a huge challenge, was a huge challenge for Ireland, and is a huge challenge for Europe, because again, I mean, sometimes the Europeans can lament the fact that they get paid very little attention in the United States, that people don't understand Europe, they don't get Europe, and lo and behold, in more recent times, Europe has become the centre of attention again in ways that they'd rather were not the case. It's about how Europe is failing to step up to the plate, how every time they announce an initiative, the initiative comes up short, and a general sense that Europe just simply cannot get its act together. And more particularly, that Europe is actually dragging down everybody else, whether that's true or whether it's untrue. And there tends to be a bit of a narrative around, certainly in the United States, and certainly in the United States politics, that were it not for the drama and the crisis in Europe, that the world economy generally would be better off, and that America in particular would be doing a lot better. Now, there may be some element of truth in that, but it's also a little bit disingenuous, and it really obscures the fact that there are issues also to be resolved here and elsewhere as well. But in any event, Europe obviously is the centre of attention. There is a sense here that what's going on in Europe is of existential dimensions, and not only do people talk about like the euro failing, but they talk about the Europe or the EU failing as an entity. For those of you who know Europe, and those of you who have been there, and those of you who study European politics, I think you probably appreciate my view, which is that it is inconceivable. It is absolutely inconceivable that either the Europe as an entity, the entity of the 27 member states, or indeed the euro area, could be allowed to fail or will fail. So my confident belief is that however we manage it, and however it's done, it not only will the European project survive because it must survive, but within that the European currency will survive because it must survive too. Obviously getting to a point where that becomes an actual reality and that we know it's an absolute fact, obviously that's still a work in progress. And as I say, people are frustrated because they feel the Europeans are slow to step up to the plate. They feel that sometimes Europe, they announce initiatives only to see them kind of fail away or fade away. But sometimes it's important to realize that European politics also has its complexities. Even though we have a financial crisis, it doesn't mean to say that you can therefore or thereby just obscure the fact that Europe is a complex political environment, as is the United States. So you see how hard it is to do business in the US Congress. Try multiplying that by 27 times in the case of Europe, or try multiplying that in the case of 17 times in the case of the euro. And you realize that the steps that Europe have taken so far over the last 3 years, shouldn't be discounted as not having delivered some results. But clearly, more needs to be done. There's no denial of the fact that the project is still incomplete. The euro, the creation of the euro currency to begin with, I think people are prepared to recognize publicly now, and do recognize publicly, that it had inherent flaws in it. So we must retrofit some of the solutions back into it, which will ensure that it is sustainable into the future. And just yesterday, for example, the European Central Bank was able to step forward in relation to a new bond buying measure or commitment, of which Ireland would be an immediate beneficiary as a country that is in the process of exiting from the bailout programme. It is important to recognise the fact that, I say, all of these entities, whether it's the ECB, whether it's German politics, whether it's the fact that we may now have an election in France, and after that we have an election in Greece, and we may have an election in Ireland. All of these things are very, very complex, and while you might, and people might wish to see clearer and quicker solutions, it is a little bit more complex than that. But I do believe that we have made progress. I do believe that the steps that we're now kind of embarked on, leading into the European Council meeting, which will take place in October, following the one in June, will begin to give stability. And even if you look at the currency markets today, or indeed the stock markets today and yesterday, you'll see that perhaps there are signs of emerging belief, that Europe will survive this challenge. For Ireland, we don't wish ill on any other country, but it is a fact that the more a bigger country is affected by this crisis, by which I mean in particular for the moment a country like Spain, and the more it asserts its right to be treated in a particular way, different to Ireland and Greece and Portugal, the better that is in some ways for us, because whatever deal is ultimately done for Spain or some of the bigger countries, Ireland would be the beneficiary of that as well. It's one thing for a small country like Ireland, to be part of the bailout programme and to have to accept the measures involved in it. But obviously, as you get into bigger countries, sometimes the disposition is a little bit different, but we can all, as smaller countries, derive some benefit from that. One of the things we most definitely expect and to derive benefit from is this immediate commitment by the European Union to separate bank debt from sovereign debt. We have had the catastrophic situation where all of the banking debt which we have taken upon ourselves, and of course this is a huge political issue as to how in the name of heavens did something that was bank debt, private debt, all of a sudden become my debt, my personal debt, or our country's debt. People say, how did all that happen? Well, that's the way it did happen, and it wasn't unique to Ireland. But all of that debt became part of our sovereign debt, affecting obviously our ratings, affecting everything else. But there is now a commitment arising out of the last European Council to separate out and to allow banking debt to be treated in a different way under the ESM, to be treated in a different way, and not to fall onto sovereign debt automatically. So that will subtract a certain amount of our debt and make it more sustainable, and make it obviously the figures more manageable. So we look forward to those emerging things. The more European policy emerges on this front, the greater the likelihood is that as it emerges and as the changes are made, they will directly benefit Ireland in particular. I say we tend to be, in European terms, somewhat of a poster boy as a country which is stepping forward, meeting the challenges, fulfilling the goals, and obviously we don't object to that categorization, but obviously if there's a better deal to be had within the deal, particularly in relation to debt and to bank debt, obviously we would wish to avail of that. So it's obviously a huge challenge for us. We look forward very much to our presidency of the European Union, which is in the first 6 months of next year, and where we will be have the management of the Union, in the post-Lisbon environment, obviously, and given our opportunity to obviously play our role in Europe and make our contribution to Europe as well, because we are committed Europeans. We're committed to the transatlantic relationship as well. We're committed and have a unique friendship with the United States, our relationship with Europe is obviously, in terms of trade, in terms of where our economy is, and in terms of where our future is, it's indispensable and it's critical to us. So we want Europe to succeed, and we will certainly play our part in assuring that. And if I could just say to you, not every country has asked its people from time to time to check and see whether they are true believers in the European project or whatever the project was from time to time. And in the face of all of this crisis and all of a kind of a perceived sense that we've been hard done by Europe, and were it not for the ECB or Angela Merkel or whatever else, we'd be a lot, and we're really being given a tough time. The Irish people nonetheless were asked to make a decision in relation to the European Stability Mechanism. I think it was only as recently as last May. You say that's most people, when the government announced that we had no choice but to have a referendum, most people said, you haven't a hope. You haven't a hope of convincing people in the face of all of this downturn, in the face of all of this anger that people were experiencing and were expressing. You hadn't a hope of convincing people that their future needed to be in Europe. But lo and behold, and this wasn't, of course, the first time that we've asked people to to express their views in a referendum on Europe. I think it's about the 5th or 6th time. No other country in Europe has had a kind of successive validations of their membership with the European Union in the same way as we have. But would we, but asking the people in the midst of this crisis, whether they could continue to subscribe to this was a rather challenging business. But ultimately, people obviously decided that the answer was yes. We're staying with Europe by whatever the figure was, 66%. We're staying with Europe. Our future is in Europe, and that we're going to be part of the European Stability Mechanism, and that we're going to be the beneficiaries of the European Stability Mechanism, in years to come. And it's very, very important, to ensure that that is the case, because, as I say, Europe is very much part of our economy, of our future, and of our politics as well. So, let me digress a little bit, and just to say to you that, when people talk about Ireland in more recent times, and when you see coverage of Ireland, obviously it addresses the question of the crisis, as I say, which is primarily a banking crisis, which is primarily a property crisis, from which the banking crisis derived. But you wouldn't want to get the impression that therefore Ireland has come to a full stop. There is a tendency just to concentrate on the fact that we have all of these problems, and we do have these problems. But you need to know also that side by side with this, the economy is actually, doing reasonably well. I say we're growing again. We have, our exports are up, and when people talk about the fact that they will grow their way out of the crisis by exports, we don't have any choice. It's the only way we can get our way out of this crisis. Our exports grew last year by 4%. They're doing very, very well. They obviously would like to do a little bit better. There would be a concern that as we're swinging out of this crisis, that other countries may be emerging into it. That would be a big problem, because we really do need everybody to grow. We export 100% of what we produce. 100% of our GDP is exported. So we export or we die. But the good news is that we are exporting, and that there is a functioning side to the economy. There's a real economy there. Unlike perhaps, and I don't want to necessarily categorize Greece in this case, but I mean, people do refer to Greece as having a very different economy in Ireland. Ireland most definitely is not Greece, no more than Ireland is Portugal. We have an economy which has a huge manufacturing side. People might be surprised a little bit to know that, our biggest industries are pharma, ICT, and financial services, and that, we are going to grow our way out of this crisis by way of exports primarily. Our exchequer revenues, the money coming into this, the government, as I say, have stabilized, and we believe that with a fair wind, and with other countries, growing as well, that we can certainly work our way out through this crisis. It's a crisis, obviously, we never expected. It's a crisis clearly we could never have planned for, but it's been a very, very sobering experience, and one which obviously, having gone through it, the mistakes that were made are obviously mistakes that will never be revisited again. We obviously, having asserted just how important the relationship is with the European Union, and it is preeminent and important, you need to know also, of course, that our relationship with the United States the United States is our biggest single export market. We continue to attract huge American FDI into Ireland, foreign direct investment into Ireland. And in fact, we in Ireland have FDI from the United States greater than American FDI into the BRIC countries combined. So Brazil, Russia, India and China combined, the investment by the United States in those countries is still not as high as the US investment into Ireland. So this has been sustained throughout the period. Many of the FDI countries that came to Ireland over the decades, we have retained them. Very, very few of them have left during the crisis period, and most of them continue to do very well. So at the moment, there are about 500 US multinational companies operating in Ireland, all quite successfully, all doing very well, all involved in export, all primarily involved in ICT, pharma, financial services and that type of thing. But there is another side to that as well, and that is to the extent that the US invests in Ireland, you need to know that Ireland also invests in the United States. And Ireland is about the 13th largest investor in the United States economy. So sometimes when you hear this narrative from Charlotte about shipping jobs overseas and all of that kind of thing, you need to understand that that's part, as we would assert, of the modern reality. But you need to also understand that this is a two-way street. So our relationship is such that Ireland, in its own small way, generates something like 85,000 jobs in the United States. The United States generates about 100,000 jobs in Ireland. So it's two-way, it's mutually beneficial, and obviously we appreciate what we get. Obviously, for, that number of people for Ireland is clearly a lot better proportionately than 85,000 here, but nonetheless it's significant and obviously very important. But in terms of the scale of it, 8 out of the top 10 global ICT corporations are in Ireland. 9 out of the top 10 pharmaceutical corporations are in Ireland. 17 out of the top 25 global medical device corporations are in Ireland. And 50% of the world's leading financial services firms are all in Ireland. They're in Ireland for a reason. They're in Ireland because they believe in Ireland's future. They're in Ireland because Ireland is part of the European enterprise, and indeed Ireland is part of the euro as well, despite the current uncertainties. They're in Ireland because we offer them an educated workforce. They're in Ireland because we speak a reasonably good form of English. They're in Ireland also because we have a tax rate of 12.5%, which is obviously very, very competitive, and obviously a tax rate which, despite the pressures from some of our European partners, we are determined to maintain. So I'm going to just stop there, if I may, and just maybe get a bit of question and answer going, and to see whether we could just have a bit of a conversation around some of these issues. But we're just very proud of our relationship with Europe. We're very proud of our relationship with the United States. We deeply, deeply care for our reputation. When Ireland entered the crisis in 2008, we suffered enormous we felt we had suffered enormous reputational damage. And maybe we were being a bit sensitive, but we really did feel that, gosh, we'll never get out from this reputational blow. How could a country, that was doing so well, have ended up in such a dramatically adverse situation? I was delighted to see today that there's an institution out there called the World Reputational Institution. I didn't know it exists, but I'm glad it does. Because if Canada is the country in the world which has the highest reputation internationally, number 1 is Canada. Ireland is number 12. We'll take that for the time being until we get back to being number 1. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very informative, stimulating lecture.